When God removes you from family who don't love you, God's protection and hidden blessing explain light up faith. There is a truth about family that many churches whisper about, but few dare to say out loud. Sometimes the very people who share your blood are the very people God must remove from your life. That statement might shock you. It might even feel uncomfortable, because from the moment we're children, we are taught that family is sacred, that blood is everything, that no matter what happens, family should always stay together. But the Bible tells a deeper story, the harder story, a truer story. The truth is that sometimes God protects you not by changing people, but by creating distance from them. And if you have ever felt rejected by your own family, misunderstood by the people who were supposed to love you, ignored by those who should have supported you, then this message may not be an accident, that it may be an answer. Because throughout the Bible, God repeatedly pulls certain people away from their families before their true purpose can begin. Joseph, Abraham, David, Moses, even Jesus himself experienced moments where those closest to him did not understand his mission. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. And once you see it, you will never look at your own story the same way again. Because sometimes rejection is not punishment. Sometimes it is protection. And sometimes the distance you cry about is the very distance God is using to save you. Before we go deeper, I want you to pause for just a moment and write something in the comments. Write this: God separated me to protect me. Not because typing words changes God, but because declarations change the heart. And when you say those words out loud or type them with faith, something inside you begins to shift. You stop seeing separation as loss, and you start seeing it as alignment. Now listen carefully, because the first story reveals something that many people never realized, that Joseph's life began with love from his father, but it was surrounded by hatred from his brothers. Joseph was not just another son in Jacob's household. The Bible tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other children, and he gave him a special robe, a robe that symbolized favor. But favor has a strange effect on people. It inspires some, and it exposes others. When Joseph shared the dreams God placed inside him, those dreams should have brought wonder to the family. Instead, they ignited jealousy. His brothers didn't celebrate the vision. They resented it. They didn't support him. They despised him. And one day, that jealousy reached a breaking point. Joseph's own brothers grabbed him, stripped him of the robe his father had given him, and threw him into a pit. Imagine the moment. The people who grew up with you, the people who shared meals with you, the people who called you brother, are now standing above you while you cry for help. But instead of helping him, they sold him into slavery. Now here is the part many people miss. From a human perspective, Joseph's story looks like betrayal, but from God's perspective, it was positioning. Because if Joseph had stayed in that house, surrounded by brothers who secretly hated him, his destiny would have died there. God didn't stop the betrayal, he allowed it. Because the pit was the doorway to the palace, that Joseph's journey took him through slavery, through false accusations, through prison. But every painful step was moving him closer to the place where God had destined him to stand. And years later, when Joseph finally rose to power in Egypt, something incredible happened. The same brothers who had once thrown him into a pit stood before him begging for food. The boy they rejected had become the man who could save them. But notice something powerful. God did not reunite Joseph with his family until Joseph had been transformed. The reunion didn't happen in the pit, that it didn't happen in prison, that it happened in the palace. Because sometimes God must change you before he reconnects you with people from your past. Joseph once said something that reveals the entire mystery of his story. In Genesis 50 verse 20, he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Let that sink into your spirit. What people meant as harm, God used as purpose. What people meant as rejection, God used as redirection. And the same may be happening in your life right now. You may be crying over a relationship that ended. You may be confused about why certain family members no longer speak to you. You may wonder why the people who should support you the most seem to misunderstand you completely. But what if God is doing what he did with Joseph? What if the distance is not destruction, but preparation. Because some environments cannot support the size of your destiny. And sometimes the only way for a dream to survive is for God to remove it from the place where it is constantly attacked. Now consider something even more shocking. Even Jesus experienced this dynamic. Yes, Jesus, the Son of God, faced moments where his own family did not understand him. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is teaching a crowd when someone interrupts him with a message. Your mother and your brothers are standing outside, wanting to speak to you. Now most people would immediately stop everything. Family is calling. Family is waiting. Family comes first. But Jesus responds in a way that surprises many readers. He looks at the crowd around him and says something profound. He points to his disciples and says, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." This was not disrespect. This was revelation. Jesus was revealing a truth that many people struggle to accept. Family is not defined only by blood. Family is defined by alignment with God. Because sometimes the people who share your DNA do not share your calling. Sometimes the people who share your history cannot walk with you into your destiny. Even the brothers of Jesus did not initially believe in him. The Bible says in John 7:5, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." Think about that. The Son of God living in the same house and still misunderstood. If Jesus experienced misunderstanding from family, why do we assume our journey will be different? This is where many believers struggle emotionally. They feel torn between honoring their family and following their calling. But the Bible shows us that sometimes obedience to God requires boundaries with people who cannot understand what God is doing in your life. Not because you hate them, not because you dishonor them, but because your path is different. Jesus never stopped loving his family, but he refused to allow family expectations to override God's mission. And that leads us to one of the most powerful moments in the entire Bible, when God first called Abraham. Before Abraham became the father of nations, before the covenant, before the promises, God gave him one command. Genesis 12:1 says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Notice the progression. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's house. God was not just asking Abraham to change location, he was asking him to change identity. Because as long as Abraham stayed in the environment where everyone saw him as just another son in the family, he could never fully become who God called him to be. Sometimes familiarity limits faith. Sometimes the people who have known you the longest are the ones who struggle the most to see you differently. They remember your past mistakes. They remember who you used to be. They cannot imagine who you are becoming. And so God tells Abraham something that echoes across history. Leave, not out of anger, not out of rebellion, but out of obedience. And once Abraham stepped away, the promises began to unfold. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. The blessing followed the separation. That principle appears again and again throughout Scripture, because sometimes God must remove you from one environment before he can release the promise in another. And yet even Abraham made a mistake that reveals another deep truth. When he left his father's house, he brought someone with him that God never told him to bring. His nephew Lot first. Everything seemed fine. They traveled together. They prospered together. Their flocks multiplied, but eventually, something changed. Genesis 13 says the land could no longer support both of them. Conflict broke out, tension grew, and finally Abraham had to make a difficult decision. They needed to separate. Now watch carefully what happens next. Genesis 13:14 says something incredibly important. After Lot had parted from him, the Lord said to Abram, God waited until the separation happened before revealing the next level of the promise. That is a powerful spiritual principle. Sometimes God is waiting to speak, but you are still holding on to someone he asked you to release. Sometimes clarity is blocked by attachment. Sometimes the next chapter cannot begin until the previous connection ends. This does not mean the person is evil. Lot was not evil, but Lot was not assigned to Abraham's destiny. And when we carry people into seasons they were never meant to enter, tension becomes inevitable. Many believers today are emotionally exhausted not because they are failing, but because they are trying to maintain relationships that God has already outgrown in their lives. They're carrying a lot into a place where only Abraham is supposed to stand. But once the separation happened, something changed. God told Abraham to lift his eyes and look at the land around him. Everything he could see would belong to him and his descendants. Vision returned, clarity returned, peace returned. Sometimes the voice of God becomes clearer when certain voices become distant. And maybe that is exactly what is happening in your life right now. You are not losing people. You are gaining perspective. But the Bible continues revealing this pattern in another powerful story. David. Before David ever faced the giant Goliath, he faced something even more painful: the rejection of his own brother. David arrived at the battlefield simply to deliver food to his brothers. But when he started asking questions about the giant threatening Israel, his older brother Eliab exploded in anger. He accused David of pride. He mocked his motives. He dismissed him completely. The person who should have supported him tried to silence him. But David did something incredibly wise. He turned away. He refused to argue. He refused to defend himself, because David understood something many people take years to learn. You do not need the approval of people to fulfill the assignment of God. And if David had wasted time trying to convince his brother, he would never have faced the giant. Sometimes you must turn away from the voices that misunderstand you so you can confront the battle God actually called you to fight. And the moment David did that, history changed. A shepherd boy walked onto the battlefield, the giant fell, and a king began to rise. But notice something important. Eliab disappears from the story because God has a way of silencing the voices that once tried to diminish you, not through revenge, but through purpose. And maybe that is exactly what God is doing in your life. You're not being rejected. You are being set apart. You're not being abandoned. You are being aligned. And the story is not over yet, because in the next part of this message, we're going to uncover even deeper biblical truths about why God sometimes distances you from family. You will discover why Moses had to leave his people before becoming their deliverer, why Gideon had to confront the idols inside his own household, and why Jesus promised that anyone who loses family for the sake of the kingdom will receive a new family far greater than the one they left behind. And when you understand this truth, something powerful will happen. The pain you once carried will begin to transform into peace. But before we continue, take one moment and do something powerful. If this message has spoken to your heart even a little, type this in the comments right now. God separated me to prepare me, because your story may be closer to a breakthrough than you realize. And if you believe messages like this help people find healing, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here at Light Up Faith, our mission is simple: to shine biblical truth into the places where people feel forgotten, misunderstood, and alone. And if you stay with me for the next part, you might discover that what felt like rejection in your life was actually divine protection all along. The story of Moses reveals another painful truth about family rejection that many believers never notice. Before Moses ever stood before Pharaoh, before he ever lifted his staff over the Red Sea, before he ever received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, he tried to help his own people, and they rejected him. Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's palace, but deep inside he knew who he truly was. He was Hebrew. The suffering of his people was not just a distant tragedy to him. It was personal. Point one day, the Bible tells us in Exodus 2 that Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Something inside him snapped. Justice burned in his heart. Looking around and seeing no one, Moses struck the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, he returned and saw two Hebrews fighting each other. Moses stepped in, thinking they would understand his heart. He believed they would see that he was trying to defend them. But instead of gratitude, he received something else. Cold rejection. Point one of them looked at him and said something that shattered Moses' world. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" Think about that moment. Moses believed he was standing with his people, but his people did not stand with him. The rejection was immediate, humiliating, and public. Suddenly Moses realized that the secret of the Egyptian he killed was known. Pharaoh would soon hear about it. Fear flooded his heart, and Moses ran. He fled into the wilderness. To Moses, it looked like failure, but to God, it was preparation. Because if Moses had stayed in Egypt trying to prove himself to people who didn't recognize his calling, he never would have encountered the burning bush. He never would have heard the voice of God calling his name from the fire. Moses, the wilderness became the classroom where God shaped a deliverer. Sometimes God allows rejection to drive you into isolation, not to punish you, but to position you where you can finally hear his voice clearly. The noise of people's opinions fades in the desert. The need for approval disappears in solitude. And in that quiet place, identity is rebuilt. When Moses returned to Egypt years later, he did not return as a man begging for acceptance, that he returned as a man sent by God. The same people who once asked, "Who made you ruler over us?" would eventually follow him through the Red Sea. But that transformation could not happen while Moses was still trying to prove himself. It happened only after God separated him. And that brings us to another story, one that reveals how sometimes God calls you to confront something painful inside your own family. The story of Gideon. In Judges chapter 6, Israel is living in fear. The Midianites are raiding their land year after year, stealing crops, destroying livestock, leaving the people starving. And in the middle of this national crisis, we find Gideon hiding. He is threshing wheat in a wine press, secretly trying to save a little food without being seen by the enemy. He is afraid that he feels small, insignificant. But suddenly the angel of the Lord appears and speaks words that sound almost unbelievable. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Imagine Gideon hearing that. A warrior? He is hiding. He is the least in his family, and his family is the weakest in the tribe. But God often sees what people cannot see. God looks at Gideon and sees a leader to deliver, a man who will break the chains of fear over an entire nation. But before Gideon can fight the Midianites, God gives him an unexpected assignment: not to attack an enemy army, not to gather soldiers, but to tear down something inside his own home. God tells Gideon to destroy the altar to Baal that belonged to his father. Think about the emotional weight of that command. This was not a distant idol. This was not a stranger's temple. This was his father's altar, a symbol of spiritual compromise that had been quietly accepted inside the family. And God was saying something powerful to Gideon. If you're going to lead my people into freedom, you must first break the spiritual chains in your own house. This is a moment many believers can relate to, because sometimes the hardest opposition to your faith does not come from strangers. It comes from family traditions, old patterns, beliefs that have been passed down for generations, things that everyone accepts, even though they quietly pull people away from God. Gideon was afraid. The Bible even tells us that he carried out the mission at night because he feared his family and the people in the town. But he obeyed. He tore down the altar. He cut down the Asherah pole, and he built a new altar to the Lord. The next morning the town was furious. They demanded Gideon's death. But something unexpected happened. Gideon's father, the same man who owned the idol, stood up and defended him. He said, "If Baal really is a god, let him defend himself." And just like that, truth began to break through the deception. Gideon's courage didn't just destroy an idol. It exposed a lie that had controlled the community for years. Sometimes when God separates you from family systems that are spiritually unhealthy, it feels like conflict. It feels like betrayal. But in reality, God may be using you to break generational chains. You are not rejecting your family. You are refusing to continue patterns that were never aligned with God's will. And that takes courage. But the Bible reveals something else that many people overlook. Sometimes God doesn't just distance you from people who oppose you. Sometimes he silences the voices of people who love you, but don't believe in what he is doing through you. One of the clearest examples appears in the story of John the Baptist's birth. His father Zechariah was a priest, a faithful man, a righteous man. But when the angel Gabriel appeared and announced that his wife Elizabeth would give birth to a son, Zechariah doubted. He asked, "How can I be sure of this?" From a human perspective, it was understandable. They were old. Elizabeth had been barren, but Gabriel responded with a surprising consequence. "You will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens." Why silence him? Because God was about to raise a prophet whose voice would prepare the way for Jesus Christ. And even one voice of doubt, even from a loving father, could have influenced the atmosphere around that promise. Oh, God removed Zechariah's ability to speak, not forever, but long enough to protect the destiny growing in Elizabeth's womb. There is a deep lesson here. Sometimes God removes certain voices from your life, not because those people hate you, but because their doubt cannot coexist with your calling. Even loving people can unintentionally speak fear. Even supportive relatives can plant seeds of limitation. And when God is preparing something powerful in your life, He sometimes creates a season of quiet around you. Phone calls stop. Conversations fade. Relationships grow distant. You wonder what happened, but maybe God is simply protecting the promise He placed inside you. Now, there is another moment in the life of Jesus that reveals how even the closest relationships must sometimes respect God's timing. Tea happened at a wedding in Cana. The celebration was joyful, full of laughter and music, but suddenly the wine ran out. Mary, the mother of Jesus, approached him and said something simple. "They have no more wine." She knew who he was. She knew what he could do. But Jesus responded with a surprising statement. "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." That response was not disrespect. It was clarity. Even the Son of God refused to act under human pressure, even from his own mother. Jesus eventually performed the miracle and turned water into wine, but he did it at the moment the Father's timing aligned, not because someone pushed him. This moment teaches a powerful lesson. Family expectations can sometimes pressure you to move before God says it's time. They may push you toward a career that feels safe. They may rush you into decisions that feel comfortable. They may question why your life doesn't follow the path they expected. But calling cannot be rushed. Purpose cannot be forced. And destiny cannot be dictated by human expectations. Even Jesus walked according to the Father's timing, not family pressure. And now we arrive at one of the most beautiful promises in the entire Bible. Because when God allows distance between you and certain people, He never leaves you empty, that He replaces what you lost with something deeper. Jesus spoke directly about this in Mark chapter 10. He said, "Truly I tell you, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father for me, and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age." Did you hear that? Not just in heaven that I end this life. God creates a new family, that a spiritual family. People who may not share your DNA, but share your faith. People who understand your heart because they carry the same fire inside them. People who pray with you, stand with you, fight beside you. And suddenly you realize something amazing. The loneliness you once felt begins to fade, because God has surrounded you with people who understand your purpose. That is exactly what happened with the disciples. When Jesus called them, many of them left their family businesses. James and John left their father in the fishing boat. Matthew left his tax booth. Peter left everything he knew. But they didn't become alone. They became brothers. That a new kind of family was born, that a family built not on blood, but on belief. And maybe that is what God is doing in your life right now. Maybe He is building a circle around you, that a group of people who see what others could not see, who believe what others doubted, who walk beside you. Into the future God prepared. That if you have watched this entire message, it tells me something about you. You are not afraid to face difficult truths. You are not afraid to ask deeper questions. And deep down, you already sense that God has been working in your life. Even through painful seasons. That before we close, I want to ask you to do something powerful. Write this sentence in the comments. God separated me to save me. Write it boldly, because that declaration may become the moment you stop seeing rejection as loss and start seeing it as divine protection. And if this message touched your heart even a little, take 1 second to like this video. Not for an algorithm, but because every like helps this message reach someone who may be crying tonight, wondering why their family relationships fell apart. And if you want more biblical messages that strengthen your faith, heal emotional wounds, and reveal the deeper truths hidden in Scripture, subscribe to the channel. Here at Light Up Faith, we are building more than just a YouTube audience, that we are building a community, a place where people who feel misunderstood, rejected, or spiritually hungry can find truth, healing, and hope in the Word of God. And if this message spoke to you today, I encourage you to watch the next video on this channel, because sometimes the message you almost skip is the one God prepared specifically for you. Until next time, remember this truth: you're not rejected. You are protected. You are not abandoned. You are chosen. And you are never alone. Stay faithful, stay strong, and keep your light shining. Light up faith.